Hi, everybody. Let's get started because we always run out of time. And I'm going to say just very few things for 30 seconds, and then Beryl will properly introduce our esteemed guest for today, who is Anooradha Siddiqi. She's a professor at Barnard College, which is part of Columbia University. And very recently, she received her tenure here, so she's a permanent colleague of ours here at Columbia. It's really important to hear her work because her voice has been key to questions of decolonization, population displacement, and encampments. I was very lucky to review her work this year and familiarize myself, and I can't wait for the talk. So Beryl, if you want to introduce Anooradha, we're so happy to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Beril Sarısakal. I'm a PhD student here at Columbia GSAP. And later, I'll be joined on stage by two AD students, Violeta Mastronardi and Haesong Kim. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Anooradha Iyer Siddiqi as our third guest here at Arguments series this summer of 2025. Anooradha Siddiqi is an assistant professor of architecture at Barnard College and is an affiliate faculty at Columbia's ICLS, IAS, SAI, and at GSAP. Trained as an architect, she practiced for 10 years in the United States and India before and earned her PhD in the history of art and archaeology from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. Anooradha's research centers on the histories of architecture, modernity, and migration with a focus on African and South Asian contexts. Engaging with questions of historicity, archives, and heritage politics, she expands our understanding of built environments, amplifying voices that have historically been marginalized and excluded from architectural narratives. She interrogates the authority of archives and epistemologies and instead draws on feminist thought and ethnographic methodologies to reveal the diverse forms of aesthetic practice and cultural production that emerge beyond these established institutionalized frameworks. Anooradha's scholarship fosters practices of collaboration, solidarity, and support. Her research raises urgent questions about constructed environments and ecologies and makes the political systems embedded on our built environments visible. In doing so, she constantly reflects on how research methodologies can be reimagined to cultivate empathy and ethics, demonstrating that architectural history can be a practice of care and of solidarity. One such work is her book, Architecture of Migration, the Dadaab Refugee Camps and Humanitarian Settlement, published by Duke University Press in 2023. In Architecture of Migration, Anooradha focuses on the UNHCR-administered refugee camps at Dadaab, Kenya, and explores how forced migration, settlement, and heritage making are embodied in spatial practices. She defies the ahistoricization of refugee camps, arguing instead that these camps contain their own politics, aesthetics, histories, and epistemologies. Weaving together archival research and ethnographic methods, she studies how colonial legacies, settlement policies, migratory traditions, and ecologies manifest in the architecture, material culture, and visual rhetoric of both refugees and humanitarian actors. What is so powerful about Architecture of Migration, beyond its rigorous yet reparative scholarship, is that it never takes scholarly and social concepts at face value. It questions and historicizes its subjects, whether it is the architecture, with capital A, the camp as a provisional space, the transience of the refugee category, or the paradox of humanitarianism. In a world where migration and displacement are reshaping our urban landscapes and our ways of living, Anooradha's scholarship feels especially urgent. Her writing and teaching remind us that architecture is not merely a neutral backdrop, but a set of material practices with profound political and ethical implications. She reminds us that seeing architecture requires seeing the history of spaces. In addition to the book Architecture of Migration, Anooradha is the author of Intersections, Minnette de Silva, recently published in 2024 by Mack, and the library book. She is the co-editor of Feminist Architectural Histories of Migration and Spatial Violence, and has contributed in volumes Writing Architectural History, Architecture and the Housing Question, and Unpacking Urban Heritage. Her writings have appeared in numerous journals, including the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, the Journal of Architecture, and Grey Room, among others. Her work has been supported by the Graham Foundation, Columbia University, New York University, Harvard University, the Fulbright Scholar Program, and numerous other institutions. Please join me in extending a very, very warm welcome to Professor Anooradha Siddiqi.
Thank you. It's so lovely and luxurious to have this invitation. Thank you, Lydia, and Beryl, thank you for that beautiful introduction. It was very moving. And I also want to thank Salsi and Shannon and others in the back who have helped. And there are, of course, as you all know, there are many university workers that make our academic gatherings possible. And I do hope you will all take time to talk to all the people who help to run this place, because they're part of our architecture as well. It's really my great privilege to be here today. And I'm learning more about the program that you're in, and it's so exciting. I was thinking as I was walking over here that I just don't get to hang around with architecture students enough. Architecture students who remind me a lot of myself back when I was a student. The kinds of questions that you're all having to face, which I think when I was in school we didn't have to face in the same way, but that I wanted to, because I come from parts of the world that maybe have had to deal with these things long before we've had to deal with them here in the United States. I think I was attuned in these ways to the kind of work I'm going to be showing you today, and to the kinds of things that I think you absolutely have to deal with. You're not going to have other options. So I'm very happy that we're all together today. And I thought I might contribute to our collective work, the collective work that I think we are all doing, with a discussion on the commons. And my discussion is going to be animated through a set of concrete works in an exhibition called Dadaab Commons. This exhibition I curated in Nairobi in March and April of this year. So it's, for me, again, a great privilege to get to share some of this material with you. This is the first time I've spoken about this since the exhibition, so you're going to get to see some of the raw and uncut material, and I'm very happy to be able to think through it with you and hear your impressions as well. So this is an exhibition curated in collaboration with the Go Down Arts Center in Nairobi. It's grounded in their collaborative artistic and urbanistic practices. It includes works by Abdul Fattah Adam, Cave Bureau, Deka Abshir, Elsa Maki, James Muriuki, Peterson Kamwadi, Yvonne Adiambo Owor, and myself, and many of us are sitting around this table on the screen. There were overseas contributions from Tirupura Sundari Seville and Devika Prabhakaran from Namvida Nambur Namkade in Chennai, and Anjali Grant in Seattle. And the exhibition included participation by several members of our community across the world. It's a collaboration that asks that we, the curators, the artists, the visitors, other participants, together craft an intellectual commons. The slide is not advancing. So the questions of Dadaab Commons begin in my book, Architecture of Migration, the Dadaab Refugee Camps and Humanitarian Settlement. It starts by looking closely at a refugee camp. A refugee camp enables us to think about an architecture of migration not only as a space of detention, but one predicated upon practices of migration, both immediate and long-term. And I wanted this scholarly story to come to life. I was privileged to work with artists and the folks at the Go Down on this project, and we met online every month over 2 years to ground our thinking on the commons and on a Dadaab commons. We struggled with an architecture of migration, forms of enclosure, land politics, the making of territory. We struggled with domesticity at the scale of the dwelling and the scale of the state. We struggled with the ephemerality of place and materiality, and also with the construction of collective knowledge. So you'll see these themes in the exhibition itself. Whoops. There. So I discussed some of these themes with my colleague Omar Barada during this long period of preparation for the exhibition, as well as Nicholas Frayne from the University of Cambridge. And if you're interested in reading more deeply, there are a couple of journals where we kind of edited our dialogues together that get into the exhibition itself a little more deeply. The themes of the exhibition really came from my focus on the Dadaab refugee camps. They were established by the UNHCR and the Kenyan government in 1991 within something that we would refer to as a borderland. And I put that in quotes because I think of it as a constructed space. This borderland in particular straddled Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia, and at one time Italy and Britain. As the chapter structure of the book shows, this is a book that thinks with the architecture of this camp as the material afterlife of past partitions, of sedentarizations of people, of an insurgent domesticity in the present, and also an archive and infrastructure for the future. Architecture of migration identifies forces of colonial and humanitarian settlement. It traces spatial and racial politics in a dense setting that manifests decades of architectural planning and design initiatives among a much older constructed environment that reflects its own ways of knowing. While environments associated with migration are often seen as provisional, lacking both history and architecture, the aesthetic and material landscapes of Dadaab, even if they were born out of emergency, reveal histories, futures, politics, and rhetorics. So countering conceptualizations of refugee camps as sites of border transgression, criminality, placelessness, I instead wanted to focus on long migratory traditions in the architecture, the spatial practices, the landscape, and also the iconography of both refugees and humanitarians. I tried to theorize them as complex settlements, ecologies, and also material archives that are created through these histories. And my narratives have not only pointed to carceral detention spaces of the nation state, but also the constructed forms and landscapes of people's imagination. So I also really tried to look not only at fixity for architecture and archives, but openness and migration. I put the humanitarian macro environment and the refugee camp in dialogue with the single individual's work or domain. And for me, this was a way of intimating the work of the architect by extrapolating it to wider architectures, histories, and also epistemes that it organizes and gives rise to. The book itself contains a material and visual archive of Dadaab that I constructed from research in around the world, in Africa, Asia, and Europe primarily. And I included that archive in the book in the form of a photographic repository, which you may have seen if you saw some of the chapters. Duke University Press was, it was important to them to support the republication of that photographic archive, and it was, I think, for them, part of the book's argument. But I also attempted to learn from people I spoke with and people whose work I read, understanding the theory offered by each as intertwined. I initiated discussions with many migrants in Africa and elsewhere, and I had the privilege of meeting people who had lived or were living in Dadaab or in refugee camps in other parts of East Africa and also the rest of the world. And in my book, I've really attempted to work with their words and the narratives they shared with me. Each of the chapters hinges on excerpts from one or more conversations with people from Dadaab. Some of these excerpts represent our only meeting, and some are an amalgamation of multiple discussions. I tried to be clear that their presentation in the form of interviews, archives, literature, and reflections raise questions that, to my mind, are inadequately answered. I really take responsibility for that, and yet also turn to these moments as a historiographical practice of restitution and inclusion. It's an ethos that, for me, is crucial to understanding architecture as symbolizing not only the power of states or empires with the capacity to usurp people's lives, but also the power of other orders, that of people whose domesticity is world-making, whose architecture can be the basis of our common histories. For this, migration offers an important concept and method for countering histories written from the archives of landed, settled institutions. And this was a premise of my conversation with these artists. Some of them had worked in Dadaab with artists from Dadaab. Some had visited Dadaab. Some worked on migration, land, or ecologies. Some worked on contemporary artistic expressions of Somali culture. As an alternative to depending exclusively on official archives, we thought we could develop a critical material and visual practice of knowledge production. So while counter-archiving is a recognized architectural, artistic, or critical design practice, it's a new methodology for scholarly history writing, and I am a historian. So I found that we were working less on a quote-unquote exhibition and more on producing an architectural or intellectual commons. These artists and architects have long directed their own creative practices. They're quite mature practitioners, and though they worked with me, in dialogue with me, they were informed by my feedback. I would say their studies were absolutely their own. They were not directed by me in any way. They agreed to conceive works that turned to Dadaab as a referent. So Dadaab Commons archives our individual and our collective thinking. The Go Down Arts Center hosted an artist residency for all of us, building on decades of their own support for artists and collectives and training artists basically to manage independent practices. They teach artists everything from art making to running a business. The Go Down is typically critical of this word exhibition. I think they're very conscious of its colonial history, and they're eager to purge the violence from processes of art making, and instead really to develop aesthetic practices of cohabitation. So in that spirit, our exhibition partnered not only with the Go Down, but with a number of different institutions in Nairobi, including the University of Nairobi Department of Architecture with faculty and students from there, Cheche Bookshop, which is a Somali-owned community space, the Madare Social Justice Center, which is a radical think tank, the Aljama Cultural Center, which is a Somali cultural center, and the Alliance Française, which is an event space and library in Nairobi Central Business District. So this is some of our meetings with the University of Nairobi students. These are the folks from the Madare Social Justice Center. So I think with that, I would like to walk you through the exhibition itself. I want to start open with a conversation, a little excerpt from a conversation I had with the director of the Go Down Art Center. This is Joy Mboya. Really lovely conversation with our friends at Aljama earlier this week. And one of the things that comes out, I think, with an exhibition like this are the ways in which different forms of identity and different forms of belonging are contested, actually. At every step of the way, many people here who are settled here, many, let's say, Somalis in diaspora who are settled here in Nairobi, will deeply identify with people from Dadaab. Others will deeply not identify with people from Dadaab as refugees or migrants. So it's these kinds of hurdles that my hope is that we don't solve problems, but we can at least open these conversations and create a platform for people to make really very material connections, which you've done you've done it in these different iterations, and I think we do that in this exhibition in different ways, asking people who are positioned in different ways. Each of the artists is actually positioned in different ways, and some of them are, let's say, deeply Kenyan, and yet have had a background. Peterson Kamwadi, I'm thinking of, who has curated exhibitions with both refugees and with specifically people from Dadaab. So it's a kind of interesting set of connections that brings all these artists together. So my hope is that this kind of connection making is what we can do here, while also being quite rigorous about the art making. I think that we've not lost in any way, in any of the works, a real rigor around practices of making. And again, I wanted to invite you to talk about that a little bit, because in addition to, in many ways, sponsoring community initiatives, the Go Down has also had one of the highest standards for art making in the region. Maybe you can talk to that a little bit.
I think the artists that have been a part of this process are really excellent. They are. They're sort of the cream of effort at the moment in this territory, in this space, and for now. And I think that the process that you went through with them contributes to that rigor. These sort of monthly or every 2 months conversations that would happen over Zoom, which I was lucky to be sitting in, for most of the sessions that you had, and to just really hear the thoughtfulness and the care with which they approached this exhibition. I think that was exciting, and then to see how that finally expresses in the work. And again, I was 100% confident that we were going to have something that it will touch you when you come through and see these pieces, and when you understand what drives them. There was no doubt about that. I know that in those sessions, as you said, there were people who are deeply Kenyan, some who have not had an experience of visiting the camps at all, but of course have had a chance to interact with the diversity that is the Kenyan space, whether they're refugees, Somalis, and all of the other Kenyan communities that we have here, and all of the challenges that we find sometimes in diverse spaces. But to just see how they still found a way in which they could explore the questions and the themes that we were asking ourselves around commons in this. So that thoughtfulness, that care, is expressed in the work. It definitely is in the work, and I think that their commitment, bringing their soul and their full spirit into it, is also found in the work. It's really lovely. It's really lovely.
Yeah, it's been a wonder for me to see this, because these are really mature practitioners for the most part, who also are quite engaged in their own practices, and so for any of us to have the time, let alone the real interest, to come together, that has also been very revealing for me, that in fact everybody really very much wanted to be together for this long conversation and to iterate the work in this way. And then all of that can also be there, but for them also to share materials and to be able to really have their work be collaborative in a sense, I think that can be extremely difficult for any artist in today's market. For all the reasons we all know, you have to create some distinction around your own work. But I think that this sense of distinction is absolutely there in each work. And then there are ways in which the works converse with one another really very rigorously. And it's not just a sort of surface connection. There's material connections, there's ideational connections. To me, that was a really a big lesson for me, that this could actually be a process-based way of producing something that then has a form, and has really distinct form in the end. So So that I also really credit with the spirit. So I wanted to sort of begin there by talking about just the intimacy of this collaboration that we all did, but that, it led to these distinct individual works, but that the works in so many ways were threaded together and really were in conversation with one another. To me, that is at the heart of the practice of the Go Down Arts Center. It was really very special to witness it. So you would have seen these pages. I think you saw the book, the little booklet that we made for the exhibition, and this kind of is the statement, the artist's statement, or I guess the curator's statement at the front of the book. One of the things that was very important to us was that we had many organic materials in this exhibition. We spent some time finding ways to put that back into the world. So we had objects made out of sisal hemp or terracotta or in some cases wood, mud. We found ways to put that back into, I guess what you would call the informal economy. So we had people in the neighborhood and around in Nairobi who could reuse those and repurpose those materials in different ways. And so there was a way in which the exhibition itself became this kind of intimate space, and it became part of the actual landscape, quite literally, quite materially. So I wanted to start with the work that I suppose opens the exhibition by Peterson Kamwa. This is a work that greets you just as you arrive. He does these really wonderful sketches, and he had spent time doing sketches of refugees in Dadaab and at the transition points where the checkpoints where people were being registered. And so the sketches are all taken from photographs over the course of 30 years. And so they are sketches of actual people, but from photographs from his archive. From those, he drew these figures, drew them onto galvanized steel, and they were cut and shaped into this doorway. And the doorway you could walk through basically into the Go Down compound, and that was the way you entered the exhibition. He likened it to, in some parts of the world, doorways have beads that hang down, and you part the beads and walk through. And so he was thinking about that, but then it was also a way for the refugees themselves to greet the visitor and welcome the visitor into the exhibition. I'll show you a little bit more about that project and this one. This is a project by Deka Abshir. Deka I got to know I got to know each of these artists individually in different ways. The fact that they came together was for me, quite a miracle. But Deka is the artist whose work appears on the cover of my book. She has been looking at the Somali Wa'ab, or the Tukul, this mobile dwelling, and she's done many painting series of this, but she started studying. She was doing many series of paintings of Tukuls in the distance or up close, but basically from the outside of the Tukul, thinking about the dwelling. She started for this project thinking about the Tukul from the inside, what it would feel like to be in an interior. And so she had been working in Vietnam for some time, learning paper-making processes, and she started stitching together these fabrics. And so she was assigned a portion of the compound that had this canvas tent, and we all couldn't help but remark, because the temperature inside the tent was so much hotter than the temperature outside the tent, and we couldn't help but think that, wow, like when refugees come to Dadaab, they're sometimes given places like this to live. It's really an almost unlivable environment, but she really turned it into a domestic space. So she got these curtains and hung the pieces that she made. The Go Down has a set of cats who were birthed on the site, and the cats just would not leave Deka's interior. So she made a series of these objects, and you could go and sit inside, and it really felt like an interior. It was the one really interiorized space. The project is called The Intimate Fabric of Identity. Maybe before I move on, I want you to get to meet Peterson and Deka. Lovely. So we're here now with Peterson Kamali, and he would like to invite you to tell about this work.
Thanks. Welcome to the work. So the work is basically the open frame of doorway, and then within one side of the frame I have these hanging galvanized metallic forms. The forms are derived from photography, referencing photographs of people, and this is across time, of people within the Dadaab.
Across time, but in specific places.
Yes, specific places.
So I'm here now with Deka Abshir, and Deka is the artist of this wonderful installation called?
It's called The Intimacy, the Intimate Fabric of Identity. The Intimate Fabric of Identity.
Yeah. We see what we are trying to show you a little bit of process.
Yeah.
So this is a name we've come up with. So Deka, I wanted to start by just asking you a few questions about the work. Can you identify the kind of overall idea of the work, and then tell us a little bit about these pieces?
Okay, thank you very much, Anooradha. So, as you know, our conversation started a while ago, and for a while I've been looking at the Wad, which is the traditional dwelling in Dadaab, as a sort of metaphor or allegory for the experience of people in Dadaab. My previous work was very focused on the exterior of the Wad, but more recently I've been looking really at the interior of the space. I think this piece is that we're currently in.
Again, I wanted to share with you I just got the videos, so I wanted you to have a chance to see them, but they haven't been edited for sound or anything yet. But the next project that I'll show you is by Abdul Fattah Adam, who is a really very unique architect. He's a Somali and Borana architect living in Kenya. This is already a kind of unicorn to have someone who has studied at the University of Nairobi, who really has a thriving practice both in Nairobi and Mogadishu. He works in the whole region, and he knows the region of Dadaab really, really well, and has spent a lot of time there also. But he did a series of very small works to think about partitions, migrations. This is a map that he made called Origins, and you see the Cartesian coordinates of Dadaab, the latitude and longitude, overlaid on this watery map of a region that Somalis think of as home. And he wrote these little stories to go along with the works. Some historians claim Somalis are descendants of the pharaohs. Geologists have also claimed the oil deposits in Somalia are greater than those in any other country in the region, even on the Arabian Peninsula. The existence of Dadaab could be attributed to this gift or curse. He did a series like this. This is a project called, the work is actually called Partitions, and there's a piece of plexiglass over this sort of leather map of Africa that is placed on this wood block, and he's cut out of the plexiglass what is considered Greater Somalia, the parts of the now 5 different countries that Somalis feel are their homeland. When most of the African countries decolonized in the 1960s, they made the decision to adopt the imperial border, the European borders that had been placed there. In that set of meetings where they made that sort of territorial decision, the Somalis were the ones who were arguing against borders. They wanted to have Africa be completely open. So it's a kind of debate that's gone on all these years. It's a very controversial debate in Kenya, where this kind of encroachment is, first of all, it's seen as encroachment or irredentism. But this sort of play on territory was part of what he worked on for his piece, which took that shape of the Greater Somalia and effectively made a camel pen out of it. He built the pen, and yes, we did have a camel in the exhibition as part of Abdul Fattah's work. Somali vein is the name of the Greater Somalia. So as part of, I should say, as part of his practice, again, he's a person who has grown up in Kibra. Kibra is often referred to as the world's largest slum. It's this large informal settlement that is part of Nairobi. He, is a very urban person, but he learned how to kit out a camel in the way that his grandfather or great-grandfather might have done. And so as part of the opening of the exhibition, he himself dressed the camel. He learned how to do it for the first time. So we included that as well. This is a project by James Muriuki. Muriuki is very known in Kenya as a photographer. But for this project, he got very interested in this idea, this gesture of holding hands, what it meant, what a hand actually is. He spoke of people's hands as the one unique part of a person, and yet the gesture of holding hands as the one thing that we all have in common. And so he invited people from all over the world. He did many little workshops in Nairobi where he took tracings of people's hands or photographs. People sent him pictures of their hands from all over the world, and he put them into a template and cut them out and then put them together in this sculpture. It was important to him for the sculpture that the sculpture be something that could continuously be added. So this is now like a little tree inside the Go Down Arts compound. It was very important to him also to show the welding joints, because he really wanted that point of connection to be visible. And that was his contribution. Two of the projects think about the camps, the settlements themselves, and think about them from the earth and the sky. And this is a project by someone who works right here on campus, Elsa Maki. She did a project for my book that was this really interesting provincialization of the view from a satellite. And she ended up provincializing the satellite itself, doing a little mini history of the Landsat 7, which is where the imagery of Dadaab comes from in the Google Earth maps and other humanitarian maps. What she learned in that process is that the satellite kind of hovers over a space to collect its data, but it has a glitch. So to refer to this glitching movement, she called the project Jitterbug. What happens is that it collects data, but when it collects the data, the data is offset. And so to make the data read correctly, you have to offset the images. So it's collecting data in strips of the earth, and it's going like this over the strips. And so she made this set of drawings of the settlement that she could then project onto. Cave Bureau took the opposite approach and looked at the settlements from below the ground. I had talked to them many years ago about, they do this sort of critical study of caves and the interlocking cave infrastructure underneath East Africa. And one of the things that I had always noted about the Dadaab settlements is, people always talk about these settlements have now been there for nearly 30 years, and they always talk about them as the result of a protracted conflict. But it was my feeling that the reason they've been there for so long is that they have access to ever-replenishing water source. There's a Jurassic-era aquifer underneath those settlements. And I asked them if they would like to study this underground cave filled with water, which is effectively what they did. And they did these sort of speculative drawings of this drawing on the right is showing one of the boreholes coming up in the camp, but that, you know, these boreholes exist that go right down into the aquifer and allow the camp to settle there. So they thought a little bit about what it would be like to be underwater and be looking up at this space. So the settlements are etched into the steel disc. There's rope hanging from the disc, and these little objects floating down into the space. So they were thinking of these terracotta beads as something that could be marking the boreholes that go down into the aquifer. In the center of this space, which you can enter, is a gourd where they hid a radio, and they're playing Radio Gargar, which is the radio station from Dadaab. And this is really the way this piece is meant to be understood, is the way it works at night. So one other element, these are all of these pieces were located across the compound. So I'm walking you through them, but you would be walking through physically the space. And one of the spaces that you end in is a library. This library is part of work that I did here on campus with a couple of my colleagues across the campus who we wanted to study a set of protests that had happened in India in 2019 and 2020. And this happened in India in relation to the citizenship laws that were being enacted effectively to exclude some people from citizenship there. We ended up making a bibliography that we were going to turn into a pop-up library, and that library, that special collection of books, has now gone all around India to different libraries and stayed in different places for a little while. So we decided to bring that collection here to Kenya, and our hope is that it will also travel from the Go Down to other libraries around Kenya. This is one of my students from Barnard who helped us with putting this together. This is a painting by Michael Soy, is one of the painters who has his studio in the Go Down compound. His painting is there in the library. And the library has little images. I can actually show you. It has a series of images on its windows, and I had included these my own photographs from Dadaab. So when you're sitting in the library, you can look at these images out the windows. So the last station is the double-decker bus, which is, you saw it in the first photograph when you walk into the compound. And in the double-decker bus, we had a postcard station. So some of what I wanted to do was have, my colleague Yvonne Adhiambo-Owuor, she's a very beautiful novelist, wrote a book called Dust, which was very important to me. I'm gonna just play you a little bit of that video. Hi, I'm Anooradha Siddiqi, and I'm here with my friend Yvonne. Hello. Yvonne Adhiambo-Owuor, who wrote this book, Dust. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the place of this book in the Dadaab Commons exhibition, and you'll hear behind us someone speaking, and that's Yvonne's own voice filling the double-decker bus. Some of what brought me to my own research in architecture of migration was my own kind of feelings of this arresting landscape of the so-called Northeast, as they call it in Kenya. And I've never been in a landscape like that where buildings seem to grow right out of the ground. And I came upon this book, and it opened up ways of understanding the landscape, not as a Somali or Borana landscape, but a landscape of struggle that is shared among people across this whole region. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that to begin with. Yvonne, maybe you could just say a little bit about what made you start researching this region.
Well, as a part of my own kind of Kenya identity formation, particularly after the post-election situation we had, the understanding, I'd always been conscious of, and I think when the crisis happened, I became very conscious of the risk and what it means to lose a country. We came so very close to losing a country, and my whole being was shattered by the sense of grief at that. So with that, in trying to find an answer to what happened in so many ways. I mean, of course, going in different parts of the country, asking the question of what it was, what it means to be Kenyan. Became very conscious of the stories, the silences, the depths of the things that we do not talk about. The fact that we're always trying to build over the tombs and ghosts and silences. We're very good at that. Accept and move on. As if the wounds, the traumas, the things that we don't talk about do not erupt one day, which for me was what the post-election violence was about. But to be honest, I traveled to the northern part of Kenya quite a bit. Well, not too often, not as often as I'd like. And for me, that's where my Kenya begins. That's where I felt the most sense of my Kenyan essence. So, and lest we forget that it's 3/4 of Kenya, so, and not too far wrong. And yeah, so that's the kind of thing that happened. And of course, I think as you mentioned, the landscape, apart from it being split.
Yeah, I appreciated very much that she reminded us that that is 3/4 of Kenya. So most of the country is this region that is treated like an outlier, like a borderland. So in the double-decker bus, in addition to Yvonne's voice, we set up a station, a postcard station for visitors to send postcards all over the world with the idea that, they would also extend the commons, the Dadaab commons. So part of what we did in that postcard station, some of what was very important to me I emphasize, I guess, throughout the exhibition were the kind of Afro-Asian connections in East Africa that come through in the work of Somalis and also just the work of different people who were involved in this exhibition. So as part of the postcard making, we had connections with a group of artists in Chennai who, Chennai itself is in India, has one of the oldest print cultures in India. It's one of the places where the first printing presses in the country were developed. Old newspapers were there, some of the first prints of books that are very important in the culture. And during COVID, a set of artists, when the whole city was on lockdown, hired some 60 woodblock printers to make customized prints and stamps of iconic objects all over Chennai, like iconic buildings, neighborhoods, the auto rickshaws, whatever. They ended up making a set of stamps for us for this exhibition based on sketches by the artists. So you see some of Peterson Kamwadi's figures here and some of Deka's sketches, Muriyuki's hands. So they sent us a set of these stamps so that they too could be part of the exhibition. And it was a little bit of this way of thinking of an Afro-Asian commons rooted in thinking about Dadaab and what Dadaab was about. The very final thing I'll show you is a thing that wasn't even in the exhibition, but we ended up in our time together in person as we were preparing and putting up the exhibition, we made this little booklet. And we decided to include the works of another artist, another Indian-American artist. I would say her name is Anjali Grant. She did a series of these little sketches, and the sketches really animate the book, which I think you've seen. You saw the PDF of the book. And she used some of the works she used my photographs, and she used some of the works by some of the artists to think with. And I'll maybe end on the note that is the end of the book, that a lesson that I take from Dadaab is to trust the many connections that persist in spite of partitions. That, for me, was part of why it was important to me to think through an exhibition like this. And I mean, again, I'm using the word exhibition as a shorthand, but I think in certain ways, the work of this group of artists was to create a kind of commons. We didn't call it that just by accident. We wanted to also problematize the commons. The commons itself isn't just an open collective space. It is, in fact, a form of territorial marking. It's a form of enclosure. But we wanted to think through the enclosure of the commons. We wanted to think through Afro-Asian enclosures, the enclosure of the Go Down Arts Center compound itself, and the literary enclosures of a booklet or a library. The other thing we really wanted to think about were domesticities, what it meant to get domestic in an exhibition, what it meant to be within the domesticity of the state of Kenya, what it meant to be living at the level of the dwelling, what that domesticity meant, and the kinds of intimacies of cohabitation. Materials from Cave Bureau's piece ended up in Elsa Maki's piece. Materials from Deka Abshir's piece ended up in Abdul Fattah's piece. So what does it mean to share and cohabit, quite literally, in the making of a space like this? But I would say that in another way, our domesticities came down to our own families. You've been looking at photographs of my own daughter in some of these pictures. Kabage Karanja's kid was there. Deka Abshir's sister was there. So many people's parents came and helped. It was really a family affair. So this project gave me a chance to really think, what does it mean to work intergenerationally? What if we think of these things more like festivals and less like objects? And for me, that's a question that I think would be a very good question for you all as designers. What if we think through process rather than through product? And finally, I think that, ultimately the exhibition gave us a chance to think through the commons. And really, what is the commons? The commons offers a practice of collectivity, which we rarely get to exercise. Our world atomizes us, individuates us. And I think this kind of practice of collectivity, the imperfect solidarities that Aruna D'Souza writes about, not creating collectives because you empathize with the other person or identify with another person, but precisely out of difference and precisely out of not understanding or not being able to translate someone. That was another thing I think we really thought of. We really were eager not to turn away from the damages of the colonial, but to embrace these past violences and not paper over them, but really integrate them into our histories. And each of the artists did that in different ways. It was important to them to integrate them within their narratives, within their imaginations, and within a kind of collective future that they wanted this exhibition to speak of. And I think that I'll just end by saying that the very most kind of important thing to us was that this be a kind of beacon. There was not one artist in this exhibition who came from Dadaab. In fact, it was really important to us that we all be outside of Dadaab and be able to send a signal that we see you, we're with you, we're in a collective with you. We don't have to be from Dadaab to understand. And I think that is the piece of this that I want to leave you with. Thank you so much.